They believe that in order to build a new economy, they have to get rid of Lenin, Stalin and the Soviet Union ways.
And at the same time increase the rates for gas. No, we've got to try reaching some kind of agreement so that later on, as the president said, God forbid we could push that button with a clear conscience. Stop twisting my words, mister.
I hope you're not going to cut this part out, what you were saying several minutes ago.
No, you'll have the opportunity to see for yourself.
You're keeping track of all the moves, aren't you?
There's no censorship here. Good afternoon, dear fellow thinkers. My video blog today is being recorded in an unusual location, namely an Ostankino television center. We met here Nikita Isayev, hot off the skillet. Our opinions about the current events differ greatly. I think that expressing our views in such an informal setting could be quite interesting. We have already talked to Nikita and decided to discuss the attempt of the United States, or rather their resolution, to pull out of the Intermediate and Shorter Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. My question is, why did the United States have to raise this question now? Why are they trying to pull out of this treaty?
Nikolai, this is yet another splash of fuel in the flame of pressure on Russia. Another cause, another occasion to proceed with sanctions, isolation approach and so on. Other reasons include Skripal's case, Russia's support of Iran, Russia's stand in Ukrainian conflict.
Let me just clarify something. So in your opinion, what we deal with here is that the US are willing to put pressure on Russia. What you're saying is there is no global geopolitics behind this decision.
Well, in fact this is global geopolitics, putting pressure on the Russian Federation to force it to cater for today's interest of the United States. And today's interest of the United States, as you rightly mentioned, is global domination, primarily in competition with China. The Russian Federation has unfortunately ceased to be a global dominating power. And unfortunately, as I see it, we need more time to recover and become a superpower, what we still keep calling ourselves. But People's Republic of China has in fact taken the place of former USSR and has almost reached the position of the second pole, which was the situation after the Second World War.
Nikita, I will interrupt you if you don't mind, so that we had some altercation going.
Sure.
To my mind, the intent of the United States to cancel this treaty speaks to their consistent wish to reshape the whole system of global politics and economy, where they are starting to lose to China today.
And security.
They are losing. When gentlemen can't win, they change the rules. And we are getting a boxing match instead of ballet. This treaty is used by the United States today to put pressure on Russia, as well as on China. We have recently discussed it on a TV show. This topic has received sufficient coverage. I believe it will soon be talked about more. The rockets that the US could potentially place in Europe will be able to reach our vital sites, Chinese facilities. As for our rockets, they are not able to reach the American targets. I mean the intermediate and shorter range rockets. With that in mind, their security is not affected. And all these statements that Russia has breached the treaty are nothing but talks to feed the poor, as the saying goes. Our security, on the other hand, is greatly affected.
Nikolai, I agree with you on the point that the US has been putting pressure, hitting hard, breaching certain internationally accepted approaches. They came up with the same justification, which was used by our state propaganda. Stop making our Iskander rockets laugh.
Iskanders don't fall under this treaty.
They do, as we said before. 1 second. Let me finish. The main point of the ideological or contextual conflict between me and you is whether or not Russia has something to bring on the table to counter the US in the negotiations that are currently in progress. Either they will manage to outmuscle us and Putin will eventually sign an agreement with Trump. It will be given to the Russian public as as a great win, because Russia has signed the agreement containing the terms and conditions not much worse than those signed by Gorbachev and Reagan back in 1987. We will have another treaty, but as the end of the day, by pulling out of the previous treaty the US will move even closer to the Russian border, militarize Ukraine, which is declaring such intents, and will jump closer to China. That is the main target for the USA.
Do you know what I would say to our American partners? I would tell them, pull out of this treaty. And then all the population of Russia, and all over the world will once again see that you cannot be trusted. One shouldn't enter in any agreements with you either in the short or long term.
What difference will it make? So what? Americans will say yes, this is the way we are.
Our defense will not be compromised. We'll simply roll back to the situation of the late 80s.
But it only took our country 2 or 3 years to collapse back then.
Nikita, one should be much more careful when comparing two historical periods. So any withdrawal from a treaty that is intended to ensure international security is a problem. But I believe that the US pulling out of this treaty today will not create extremely serious security problems. So, go ahead. Pull out. But after that, don't try to pull us into any agreement with you. I agree with you that they are trying to persuade us to side with them against China. But how can we agree with you on anything today, if you have just breached the obligations you assumed yesterday?
By rule of the gun. Back in the day when you were Russian Empire, you used to conduct wars against Turkey by rule of the gun. Entered the Crimean War. Participated and won in the Great Patriotic War. But it was in the past. Now by rule of the gun you cannot even handle the conflict in the Ukraine, to solve the Donbass problem to your own profit. You, as Russia, are not able to use the rule of the gun to finalize the military operation in the Middle East and set your spheres of influence there. You are pushed out of the negotiations on North Korea, held basically between the USA and China.
Who's the one interfering with our actions in Ukraine and Middle East?
It's clear. This is what I call rule of the gun. As for us, we have to clearly realize where we are today. We mentioned that they keep increasing gas payments. The point is they are getting real about the economic situation in their country to avoid the budget misbalance. Here in Russia the budget issues are solved the easy way. They simply push the start button on the printing machine and that's it.
Nikita, they don't increase gas rates in the Ukraine because they are trying to get real, but rather because IMF demands it.
Yes.
Why does IMF demand them to do this? To affect people's quality of life.
They believe that in order to build a new economy, they have to get rid of Lenin, Stalin and the Soviet Union ways.
Increase the rates for gas. IMF is an organization whose primary objective is to enslave a state. Their credits are provided never to be paid back. There are different methods for that.
What about Russia giving Yanukovych 15 billion of credit?
Thank God we only gave 3 out of 15, and they won't pay back.
In order to buy Ukraine.
Ukraine is worth much more than that.
At that moment they needed this much.
Let's get back to the treaty under discussion. The first question, will this treaty be terminated? What do you think?
I don't know. This will depend on the balance of others' interests, including the Ukraine. Or should I say Russia's influence on the Ukraine, including the upcoming election period of 2019, including the situation in the Middle East, in Syria, which is coming to the end and Americans are going to pull their main forces out of there, secure their victories, their influence areas. This is what's on the table in negotiations with Russia. Shoigu said that the only topic of discussion is Middle East.
They are not going to pull out of there. I agree that it's rather difficult to tell what's going to happen to that treaty. But it is now obvious that after the USA walkout, this treaty sort of exists, but on the other hand it doesn't. Because it's not clear any longer whether it needs to be followed. It's the same as with Iran nuclear deal, which became impractical immediately after the statement from the United States.
Do you believe in any current international agreements signed by the US? I don't.
I believe in agreements in general. I believe that whether we come to an agreement or not, we've got to try reaching some kind of agreement so that later on, as the president said, God forbid we could push that button with a clear conscience.
Not earlier than 3 minutes ago you were saying, why negotiating with them? Don't come to us with your agreements. And now you are saying that we have to try to negotiate.
Stop twisting my words, mister.
I hope you're not going to cut this part out, what you were saying several minutes ago.
No, you'll have the opportunity to see for yourself.
You're keeping track of all the moves, aren't you?
There's no censorship here.
The situation is as follows: when Americans are trying, and I agree with you here, to muscle something through with us, to get something, threatening to pull out of this treaty, we have to tell them, you can terminate this treaty, no problem. But you're not going to get anything. This is the point. But after that, don't come trying to reach an agreement with us on some serious point. Because we can't treat you seriously any longer.
Nikolai, do you think we have any real negotiating position? Please, honestly tell me, can we say, hey, Bolton, get lost? We don't need you here. We are going to reach an agreement with China. We have support from some Eastern European countries, in Ukraine, or in the Ukraine.
I hope we negotiate with Bolton with the sense of self-respect. This is the only way out there to talk to Americans. It's useless to start negotiations with them as you don't have that approach.
This is the only way. The reality is that back in the 80s similar hawks pushed us around, including building fire under the arms race back then.
It was pure treason.
Of course it was. But what's the difference between today's people and those ones?
Today there is no treason when it comes to foreign affairs.
What about Cam Ranh base in Vietnam? The base in Cuba?
We'll be back to the bases.
But was that a treason?
In the very beginning of Putin's presidency, we couldn't resist against Americans' will. The situation was completely different. Today we have everything not to give ground anymore. And that's one of the main achievements of Putin as president.
But where's the money in our country? Where is the money coming from?
I suggest not to raise additional topics, because money requires a separate discussion. We might get back to this later. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions on the treaty. You don't know what will happen to this treaty in the end. Will Americans manage to get any concessions on our part as a result of negotiations on staying or leaving the treaty?
I believe they will. And this, fortunately or unfortunately, would be reasonable for us. Because the longer we delay the real negotiations, rather than fill the air with words, and prove our imperial greatness, which unfortunately we don't have anymore, I like the idea of empire too, Nikolai.
You are too deeply undercover.
No, I have always said that openly. We are currently no power. I remind you of the defeat in the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century. Only the liberal patriotic nationalist reforms by Alexander II allowed Prince Gorchakov to call off the restricting clauses under the Paris Peace Treaty in 1871 and return Sebastopol and our fleet. This was the only way. Now we have to do the same thing to prove that we are a modern state.
I'd like to highlight that Sebastopol never left the empire, but the fleet reappeared there after certain diplomatic maneuvers of Russia. As far as I'm concerned, I believe that Americans will not get anything from us this time around. And that's why it's quite possible that the US will actually withdraw from the treaty. As far as liberal reforms, which in your opinion helped Russia recover, it was not the case at all. The reforms implemented by Alexander II, who I respect a lot, led to increase in terrorism, his assassination,
and the Industrial Revolution.
And only Alexander III managed to prevent our country from falling down the abyss. That's exactly why liberals don't like him. Patriots always support industrial revolution. Let it just happen on its own accord. But it doesn't mean you have to let terrorists do what they want in the country.
Judicial reform, zemstvo reform and so on. And we, a country comprising 1.5% of the world economy, are trying to square off against the collective West, which constitutes half the world.
Dear viewers, you've seen the difference between our positions. If Nikita allows me to rephrase his position in just a couple of words, it's called Kotz suggests surrendering.
Whatever, Nikolai. Thank you anyway.
Thank you, Nikita.